Energy Matters podcast. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I am your host Kassem Alokla from Texas A&M University, Society of Petroleum Engineers. The aim of this podcast is to discuss and explore some specific topics about the energy industry in general and the oil and gas in specific, while covering some related topics in environment, economics, policy, and many more. Today's episode on exploring the depth, a dive into subsurface management, with our guest speaker, Mr. Chris Isenberger, the Gulf Coast and Rockies Subsurface Manager at ConocoPhillips. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to come back to university and get the opportunity to speak to Aggies as well as the Petroleum Engineering Department.
Thank you so much. All right, let's go ahead and start with our questions. And here, I usually ask our guests the first opening question, which is, what does energy matters mean to you?
I think to me, energy matters means energy is essential. Energy is involved in every aspect of our lives. I think it's essential to daily life, and it's also essential for development. If you think about where we've gotten as a Western civilization, as well as where our developing countries in this world are coming, they all require energy. And to have growth and to increased livelihoods and whatnot, it all requires energy. And so, from powering our houses to heating our homes to transportation, to our devices, to the materials that we're using to record this podcast, they all require energy or energy products. And whether that's oil and gas or alternative energies and renewable energies, right? It's all essential.
Definitely. And now let's move to some questions related to your education and career. So you attended Texas A&M University for your undergraduate degree in petroleum engineering, where we are now. So please tell us more why you chose this major and what made you interested in oil and gas business in general.
Absolutely. So I grew up on the east side of Houston, Texas. My dad was an engineer. He's an Aggie, class of 72. Wow. So coming up through high school, I was always pretty good at math, science, and I really kind of enjoyed that. So I think, I was always kind of leaning towards engineering. And the part of town I grew up in is kind of near where all the refineries and petrochemical plants were. So in my mind, oil and gas industry was downstream refining and petrochemical. So I actually came to Texas A&M as a chemical engineer.
Oh, wow.
So through my dad's company, I actually spent summers working in the refineries, my first 2 summers as a pipe fitter helper. And, while that's not exactly what a chemical engineer is, I realized pretty quickly I'm not really interested in working in refineries. I'm not interested in that type of work. So I kind of came back and thought, okay, what do I want to do in engineering? I had a roommate, really good friend who was a petroleum engineer. I was like, hey, what is petroleum engineering? I came to the department, talked to a couple advisors and said, hey, I'm in chemical engineering, thinking of changing. What is petroleum engineering? So they kind of talked through it some, and I was like, okay, drilling, completions, that sounds really interesting. Sounds like it could be fun. So I took my first intro to petroleum engineering class. It used to be called 205. Okay. 1 hour seminar course, and from there I was hooked. Oh, nice. I think just the idea of being out in the elements, I think it was really interesting to me, drilling holes in the ground. I think, the thing I still really love about it is we're dealing with things that are 2 to 3 miles in the ground, or they're miles away from where we are on a location on the surface, and just trying to understand what's happening, trying to understand the uncertainty, understanding risk if you're in an exploration phase of a project, and just I think that uncertainty and trying to capture that and to mitigate that is what really interests me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think we share a similar story. I started my bachelor degree in chemical engineering, but then the next semester I just switched because I couldn't stand chemical engineering, and I found petroleum as something interesting. As you mentioned, like this ambiguity underground is something that's really interesting and exciting for us as engineers to explore and see how can we exploit the maximum out of our resources from underground.
Yeah, and I think it takes a special type of student or person to thrive in that, because it can make a lot of people uncomfortable.
Exactly.
To not, there's some certainty in building a road or building a bridge or building a plant.
Exactly.
But there's still, like we said, there's a lot of uncertainty in what we do, and you have to be comfortable with that. Exactly. You have to be able to stretch yourself to be able to accept that.
That's true. Yeah, petroleum engineers are always curious people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it needs that curiosity in order to to be a successful petroleum engineer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Now, let's start talking about your career. So you started your professional career with Weatherford International, and you spent 5 years at the company. Please tell us more about that experience, especially leading international projects in various disciplines involving production optimization, artificial lift, intelligent completion, and so on.
Yeah, sure. So I graduated in 2000. We had just come out of a price crash. The department was way different then. I think there were about 20 in my graduating class.
Wow.
So across the nation, all the petroleum departments were pretty small. But we had just come out of the 98 price crash. There were very few jobs available. I think out of 20, 8 or 9 of my classmates got jobs with operators. So we kind of had to look for some opportunities. And so I went and worked for a small company that was actually a software company. And they were providing software that did artificial lift optimization, production optimization. So I took that opportunity, kind of stepping out of my comfort zone, having to program, having to somewhat provide support. And over that time, that company got bought several times, eventually by Weatherford. But through that, I worked on various projects doing, like I said, artificial lift, production optimization, kind of doing a lot of project management. And then eventually at the end of that, kind of helping manage Weatherford's Intelligent Completions Group. And that was a company they had bought. It was in the early days of fiber optic pressure and temperature gauges, as well as fiber optic flow meters. And so it was really interesting to be on kind of the cutting edge of the fiber optics. Now fiber optics are used everywhere, from PT gauges, we have DAS, we have strain gauges. It's kind of a regular routine part of our data acquisition. So it provided me the opportunity to travel across the U.S. quite a bit because we were doing projects for all the U.S. companies as well as not international companies. I spent quite a bit of time in South America, Southeast Asia, some time in Europe. So it was really my first introduction to the international side of the business as well. And just some of the challenges that come with that when you're working in a very different, high-cost environment, high pressure. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we can summarize this like you started from the production aspect of petroleum engineering as your first career. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. All right. So now moving to ConocoPhillips. In 2005, you joined the company as a senior production engineer. Could you please tell us more about some of the earliest job positions at the company?
Yeah. So about 2005. Oil prices, gas prices had recovered, were really good, and the operators were out looking for people out to externally hire. I always wanted to get back and be a petroleum engineer, not really working on the service side and managing projects. And so ConocoPhillips gave me the opportunity to come on as a production engineer. So I was utilizing what I had done for Weatherford, for the first 5 years. And so went into our San Juan Basin as a production engineer working tight gas.
Okay.
So I had about 1,000 wells I was responsible for. And really working on artificial lift, which was mainly plunger lift, doing recompletions up hole, kind of doing lease reviews, working with integrity issues, repairing wells, writing procedures and whatnot. From there, I moved over to our South Texas asset as a reservoir engineer. So that was my first step really into subsurface.
Okay.
So acted as a reservoir engineer, worked with a geoscientist, partnered together, and we were looking for drilling locations. So justifying, evaluating, choosing completion zones, helping the completion engineers design completions and bringing wells online. As well as, and that was probably my first introduction to business and planning. Had some opportunities to work for that asset on laying out our long-range plans on a yearly basis, as well as doing budgeting and whatnot. So.
Okay, cool. That's really exciting. So you moved from production to reservoir and then like business management, something.
I was still really predominantly reservoir engineer. It was kind of a side job to do the long range planning, looking at forecasting capital needs, production coming from new wells, right? So it was really on the development side versus the base production side.
Perfect.
Got the opportunity to lead some projects, doing some unique kind of special projects in that asset. And then I had the opportunity to move over to exploration, which was my first time in exploration. So in ConocoPhillips, we have roles that are called project integration managers. So really, you're helping to lead a project, but you don't have direct reports. So you're really learning you're using your influence skills to be able to execute projects. And so it was my first time in exploration. which was a steep learning curve, working with a lot of geoscientists, and right on the early phase of exploration, there's less engineering to be done, a lot of geoscience characterization. So really understanding the language and the methodologies and how we're characterizing it. And so that was my first stint into exploration. We drilled an exploration well, moved on from there, went to Norway. So Norway, I led a group of reservoir engineers, some chemists, really managing the base of our Norwegian assets that we operate. So really, that was my first exposure to conventional, to water flood, right? So continuing to build my skills as a reservoir engineer. A lot of really interesting projects, and came back to lower 48, to our Niobrara asset at the time, which we had, and was asked to kind of create a development strategy going forward. So it was an early appraisal, this asset, and so it was like I was asked to create a development strategy. So it was really my first introduction to decision and risk analysis, and kind of thinking through strategies and implications and what are decision criteria that we should be using. And so it was less reservoir engineering, but really around laying out a strategy and considering multiple strategies.
That's really cool. So how can you describe, for example, the jump from unconventionals to conventional? Was it like a steep learning curve, or basically like similar principles?
So I would say I've kind of went from conventional to unconventional. My early tight gas, right, was really just still Millidarcy rocks that you're dealing with. They're still hydraulically fracturing vertical wells, but some of the similar principles that we're dealing with in unconventional. So I kind of dealt with that, then went to conventional water flood assets, then kind of came back, and Niobrara was really my first stint in unconventionals, and so that was my introduction. And that was still that was probably about 2015. So it was still in the early days of unconventional. So we were still learning a lot. So
cool. So you mentioned about Norway. So looking into your bio, we can notice that you have several roles in different subsurface positions, and of course in different geographical locations. Since you mentioned Norway, you also had some roles in China, right?
Yep.
So how do you generally navigate the complexities of working in different regulatory environments and cultural contexts?
I think that's one of the things I actually enjoyed the most about being able to travel and having the opportunity to work international for ConocoPhillips is going into a different culture. I spent most of my early career in the U.S. I had traveled some working for Weatherford, doing projects, but you're really just there doing some work and then you're in and out. Actually going into a different company and working within that country for the same company, but there is definitely a different culture. And so trying to figure out what drives the culture, what motivates your team members, and also trying to figure out, okay, how do I leverage that to the advantage of what we're trying to accomplish? I think, it's challenging, but it's really, really interesting. And I think, that's one of the things I've enjoyed the most about working overseas is just trying to manage the cultural differences and at the same time learning to appreciate those cultural differences too, right? There's a reason each of those cultures are the way they are, and there's benefits to that. And so working within that and figuring out, okay, how do I take what was my American culture and how do I leverage it as well as how do I change it to fit where I'm going to be, right? And to make an influence and be able to have a positive impact. I think from a regulatory perspective, you mentioned, right? Even in the U.S., as you manage from state to state or federal to state, federal to private, right? There's all these different regulatory environments that you're dealing with. And I think, it stretches you to have to be able to manage all that. And I was thinking as I was walking up here, I was on this question, in school they don't teach you this, right? In school you come out thinking all I have to do is solve some technical problems. They're engineering solutions, I can solve that and I move on, right? But as you progress in your career, or even as just early reservoir engineers, right? You're dealing with regulatory environments and impacts, and it's influencing the decisions that you're making. So it really stretches you to be able to think, okay, these are different problems. They're not quite, regulatory is not always concrete answers. So that makes it really interesting, And then being overseas, right? Completely different regulatory regimes, whether it's onshore, offshore, government regulations are different. So just finding ways to maneuver through those, right? You have an experience from one country that you're bringing to another, but the way you solved problems in the previous country may not be viable in the regulatory environment that you're in. So how do you take those solutions and alter them so that you can implement them in a different way in that new place. And so I think those are the things that really excite me about being able to go overseas and to be able to bring some new ideas and then figure out how do I alter those ideas a little bit so I can implement them and have an impact.
Great. Yeah, I think this is like the main characteristic for a leader, to like try to adapt to different environments, even if we are still working at the same company, but like geographical distances might impact, for example, the working culture in a bit, like of course the people attitude, but for sure like the adaptability and impacting the others in a positive way will for sure have an impact on the progress for project and also the team as like a group. Perfect. Moving to the next question. So can you tell us about your journey and experiences that led you to your current role as the Gulf Coast and Rockies Subsurface Manager at ConocoPhillips? I know that you have moved into several positions until you reached this big and important position in ConocoPhillips, leading like the Rockies and also the Gulf Coast, which is two big business units at ConocoPhillips. So yeah, what does your current role entail in general?
Okay, I guess there's kind of two questions. How did we get there, and then what are we currently doing? So we kind of left off. I'd come back, was in working our Niobrara. From there, I went back to exploration the second time. And so as a project integration manager again, and we were executing multiple unconventional exploration projects within the lower 48. So managed through those for a couple years. Those kind of were wrapping up, and I was kind of needing something to do. So within our China business unit, we were evaluating potential opportunities, and they wanted some support from an unconventional perspective. So I did that. And then out of that came an opportunity to go to China. So I went to China as our subsurface development and exploration vice president. So really kind of a subsurface manager and exploration manager. Did that for a while, and then in 2021 came back to our Gulf Coast and Rockies business unit as our subsurface manager. So it's just kind of been a natural progression of continuing responsibility and then continuing to build my expertise and build my leadership, I think, to come back. So my organization, which is a subsurface organization in Gulf Coast and Rockies, so made up of two teams. I have a operations geology team, and their responsibility is planning and geosteering our wells. ConocoPhillips, we believe we still get significant value out of being very active within our assets and where we're placing our wells. And we're squeezing every incremental value we can out of those wells as cost efficient as possible. So I have a team that's what their predominant responsibility is. I also have a chief reservoir engineer for the business unit who's an assurance. He was in my team as well. And then I have a reservoir characterization team. So within Gulf Coast and Rockies, we have two main assets, the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, which everybody's familiar with. And so we have asset teams that are responsible for development, near-term solution, near-term problem solving, near-term optimization. So in my group, we have a reservoir characterization team supporting both of those assets. And we're really looking for what are those future opportunities to optimize our development, to increase recovery? How do we be more capital efficient? And really thinking a little bit, 3 to 5 years out. And really, how do we take what we're doing today and make it better in the future? Obviously, to increase resource recovery. And whatnot. So
perfect. Thank you so much. So subsurface management is a complex area involving cutting edge technologies. How does ConocoPhillips stay at the forefront of technological advancement, and how do you incorporate these innovations into your operations?
So innovation, I would say, is at the heart of one of ConocoPhillips' core values. So we have what we call our spirit values. One of those I's is innovation.
Yes.
So it's very important to us. So we're constantly looking out for new technologies, new innovation to increase our competitiveness, right? And so I think everybody's trying to do that, right? Obviously, you need to. But I think as a company, we really encourage that idea. We have things where we'll have workshops or conferences which are focused on innovation, or for instance, right now, digital technologies is a big thing, right? So we'll have digital workshops or digital upscaling workshops to increase the skills of our staff. I think things that one of the examples of something cool that we've done is multiple times in these workshops we've actually replicated the Shark Tank show, where you put senior leadership on a panel and you open it up, and people will bring ideas of innovations that they're thinking, hey, if we had some funding, we could implement this and it would reduce cost, increase recovery and whatnot, right? And we let those groups pitch to our senior leadership.
Wow.
And then the senior leadership actually says, I like A, B, and D, and they actually will go fund A, B, and D, right? So it's really encouraging people to bring ideas forward in a unique way that people are comfortable with, right?
Exactly.
And then and then we go implement them, right? As well as we're always looking outside, right? Within the industry, we look outside of the industry. Our executives, leadership team will regularly, about once a year, not regularly, we'll go to Silicon Valley and see what all the new companies are doing, right? Because
in terms of technologies.
In terms of technologies, right? From AI to data analytics to supply chain, right? There's a lot of things that impact our business outside of just drilling and completing wells. And so how do we leverage technology to improve our bottom line? And so yeah, I think innovation is really, really important. And you see that in a lot of things, especially as we're trying to make this energy transition, right? Of how do we use technology and innovate new ways of doing our business.
Exactly. Optimizing operations in a cost-effective way.
Yeah, and reducing emissions, right?
Exactly.
I think obviously the most capital efficient locations and wells are going to be the best.
Exactly.
So we've also found that the lowest emitting wells and facilities operate the best, right? So by reducing emissions and having efficiencies, we're going to produce better wells, which are going to give us better returns on our investments.
Absolutely. So could you share some success stories or significant project that you've been involved in during your time at ConocoPhillips and what made them particularly memorable or impactful? It doesn't have to be something technical. It can be like any kind of project that you were involved in and that made a great memory in your mind.
Yeah, I can think a couple. I think we can start in Norway. I had the opportunity. So the asset that I was working in Norway was a conventional water flood. Sometimes in those type of reservoirs and developments, you can get what's called a non-matrix breakthrough event. So you get a, lack of a better description, a highway from your injector well over to a producer. And that can shut down that production well. So we had one of these events occur when we were in Norway. And it was actually quite a distance, and it wasn't something we had really experienced or expected. So it took us 2 years of working through this from a characterizing, from a subsurface perspective, what may have happened, collecting some data, and then trying to figure out, okay, how do we solve this problem? So we actually worked through, this was one of those regulatory things where there were some ideas out of our US-based operations that worked and were very successful, but within China or within Norway, they didn't fit their regulatory environment. So we had to think about, okay, so how do I take this idea and how do I do it here and solve this problem? So we actually ended up so when you're solving those problems, it's called conformance.
Yes.
Right? So they're conformance jobs.
Correct.
And at the time, we pumped the largest conformance job in the world.
Wow.
And we pumped over 3,000 barrels of cement into the reservoir. So the idea of pumping cement into a reservoir just kind of in my mind, it blew our minds, right? And to pump that volume. And then just the logistics of doing that offshore. Of pumping for 12 hours of cement, worrying about setting up, logistically moving cement, mixing cement from supply vessels to onshore platforms and whatnot. But with appropriate planning, with a lot of logistical considerations, we were actually able to put this job away, and then actually were able to restore production. We didn't have to re-drill an injection well. And then they were able to repeat that several times after I left. But just to be able to do something that kind of out of the box, right? And I think what was also really is it involved a lot of people. And it took a lot of understanding of characterizing the reservoir, understanding the risk to wells. How do you logistically execute this? Getting regulatory approval, and then going through the execution and then being successful. So that one's I think is really interesting, especially from the subsurface perspective. It was really fun. For me, I've been through exploration a couple times. I really enjoy being in exploration. I think just the aspect of, okay, whether it's a rank wildcat well on a conventional side or even somewhat unconventional where you have, you're maybe looking at extending plays outwards, right?
Yeah.
And trying to justify why the petroleum system may be there and what are those risks.
Exactly.
And really understanding those uncertainties and trying to narrow those uncertainties and then figuring out, okay, what kind of program do I need to execute, to implement, to be able to reduce that uncertainty enough that your company is comfortable with going forward and spending capital to go drill wells that are relatively high risk. With that comes a lot of other things, right? Regulatory, government affairs. And so I, as a project integration manager, I really had the opportunity to go out and engage with our stakeholders, from surface to subsurface landowners to government to regulatory to federal. So being able to be part of that as we're trying to implement programs and seeing the whole picture was really, really fun as well. So I've enjoyed my opportunities in exploration. So and it's always fun to drill exploration wells when you don't know
anything.
You don't know anything,
Exactly,
right? And you're not really sure what you're going to get. And so I think those are one of those others that's exciting, right?
Sure.
To me, that's exciting, and that uncertainty and.
Exactly.
Obviously, we're mitigating risk while we're doing that, so it's not risky or dangerous. It's just uncertain of what you're going to find, and then drilling those wells, collecting that information, trying to start to flow back those wells, and then you don't know, am I going to get water? Am I going to get oil? Am I going to get the right amount of oil? That's really interesting.
Yeah, and how to optimize this. Yeah. Thanks so much. This is really impressive. Thank you for sharing these two stories. All right, let's move to the next question here. Collaboration is often crucial in large organizations like ConocoPhillips. How do you facilitate effective communication and collaboration between different teams and departments as a manager?
Yes, I think first it's kind of setting the expectation, right? That there will be collaboration, helping demonstrate and explain why we need to work together. That whether it's one person, one group, one asset, probably doesn't have all the knowledge, all the skills, or all the experience to be able to bring our best solutions forward, right?
Definitely.
I think an example would be very simple as, you could have a location and give it to a drilling engineer and say, this is an XY, right? Well, he can drill a well from point A to point B, but is that the best solution, right? No, you have to bring in the geologists, and you have to bring in the reservoir engineers, and you have to understand what's happening subsurface, what's happening offsets, right?
Exactly.
And it takes a team to be able to do that. I think the same thing, when you're evaluating performance, right? There's a lot that goes into performance, not just subsurface, but you have, your completions. What did I pump and why? Sure. Am I optimized from a production and engineering standpoint? Do I have facility limitations? That may be, right? So there's a lot of things that go into optimizing our returns on our investments. And so the only way to do that is to collaborate, right? Yeah. And I think, as well, ConocoPhillips, being one of the largest independents, right, is we have a lot of experience across the globe. Sure. And so you also need to be able to collaborate outside of your asset or your smaller team, right? Because there are assets, international or outside, in Alaska, for instance, where they may be doing things differently, right? And so the ability to be willing to go ask of, hey, we're experiencing this, or we're having this difficulty, or we're having this success. What are you doing? Can you help us understand our problems better, or do you have ideas on solutions? And so I think, one of the advantages of being at such a large company is with such a diverse set of assets and engineers and types of reservoirs is we're able to leverage all of that. And, you have to collaborate to do that, right? So.
Perfect. So it's all about lesson learned from different aspects of the business and just learning and continuing.
Yeah, I think lessons learned is one of them, but I think things are constantly changing, especially in the unconventional realm, right? In lower 48, things are changing so fast, and it's hard. Not one person can keep up, and not one group can keep up. So you have to be collaborating, whether it's across, the Eagle Ford to the Bakken to our Permian assets, or leveraging our central functions, which have a lot of subject matter experts in them. And so, I think to be the best that we can be, you have to collaborate. You have to be willing to reach out, right? And I think over time you learn by reaching out and by collaborating, you only come to a better answer. I think that's one thing I've learned both as a leader and as a contributor is like when you're overseas, you're a little more isolated sometimes.
Sure.
And so sometimes you have more responsibility, you have a bigger scope that you're responsible for. And you have to be able to reach out.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to reach back to corporate sometimes and say, hey, we're fighting this, we're having this struggle, can you help us, right?
Sure.
And not be afraid that it looks bad, right? Or it shows that, well, you don't know what you're doing, you're not competent in some way. We have some expertise and we have limitations on certain things, and so you have to be able to reach out and collaborate and ask for help. I think that's,
Yeah, I totally agree. Collaboration is a key for all success. And talking about success, we always have some challenges in our careers. So what are some of the biggest challenges that you faced in your leadership roles at ConocoPhillips, and how did you overcome them?
I think leading people's always somewhat of a challenge. I think my time in exploration where nobody actually reported to me.
Okay.
We were leveraging our business units to execute work programs. And so as the person responsible for executing and implementing these programs, you had to influence. You had to use influence and to get things done. And so I think, that was always interesting and challenging, right? Is how do you influence people who have other responsibilities as well as supporting you when you don't have a say and you're not their manager or their leader, right? And you're actually in a different organization. Yeah. So I think that's one thing. I think it's just learning how to adapt. I think being clear to what your needs are and to why you're making requests as well. I think, managing international is different as well. Like we talked about, you're dealing with culture. Yeah. And I think, so it can take you some time to understand the culture and to understand what will drive the behaviors or the work that you need, right? And working within that. Sure. Especially at a leadership level when you're dealing with international oil companies, right? Or national oil companies. And sometimes there's different drivers as opposed to what you
different
have.
Systems,
right? Different cultures, different customs, different drivers. And so how do you, managing through that and trying to figure out, okay, how do I meet their drivers as well as what I need to accomplish for the right metrics, right? So I think that's always been a challenge, but it's also the most fun. It's one of the things I think I enjoy about my opportunities to be in leadership and to manage is to be able to try to find how do you deal with these difficulties and how do you deal with these different opinions and different drivers that different groups or companies or organizations may have. So
perfect. Thank you. Let's switch the gears and just start talking about the energy industry in general. As all of us know that currently we are witnessing a lot of changes, especially in the past couple of years. In the energy industry, talking about energy transitions, energy mix, or energy evolution, any term that we want to mention here. So the energy landscape is constantly evolving, especially with the increasing focus on renewable energy sources. So how does ConocoPhillips navigate these changes, and how do you see the company's role in the future of energy?
Sure. So ConocoPhillips, we have what we've publicly stated as our triple mandate. One is to be on the journey to the energy transition. Okay. Two or we'll participate in the energy transition. Two is we will have competitive returns on our investment, obviously. And then three is our journey to net zero. Sure. So we've committed to being net zero by 2050 as a company. So on that net zero journey, we can start there. So we've already publicly committed that by 2030, we will have zero routine flaring. We will be near zero on our methane emissions, which we're actually ahead on both of those, as well as we will reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions from a 2016 number. We're now at 50 to 60%.
Cool.
But originally we were at 30 to 40, but we've made so much progress on stepping through that that we every year we continually to say we're doing better than we've said. So we're actively doing that. So for instance, in lower 48, we've actually reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% since 2019. Our flaring is reduced our routine flaring is reduced by 80%. So I think as a company, from an emissions perspective, we're really, really focused on that. And then we're continuing to look for opportunities to reduce emissions. We're starting to use batteries on our drilling rigs to meet peak demand. So when you have that backup battery for peak demand, you can run less generators, which is more efficient on the generators. It actually reduces the emissions from the generators as well as the amount of diesel that you're using. Where appropriate, we're electrifying our frac fleets or running them off gas, natural gas as well. Right, so those are lower emissions.
Sure.
We've instituted quite a bit of methane emissions monitoring, right? We're using drones, automated drones. We have operators now who are drone pilots, flying around our fields and actually looking for emissions so we can address those. We're actively looking at, we're switching our pneumatics to air, right? So all of our greenfield new projects are being done with air pneumatics versus natural.
Drilling operation?
No, so your facilities, right?
Oh, okay.
So a lot of your facilities, the valves and control valves are controlled using the gas that your wells produce.
Sure.
But every time those move, there's a emission from that, right?
Exactly.
So we're actively new projects. We are putting in air.
Okay.
Right,
No
for
emissions.
normal operations,
Nice,
right?
nice.
And then for brownfields, we're come back and retrofitting those as well.
Cool.
And then where appropriate, we're also, trying to electrify as much of our operations as possible. And I think the other part of that is this water, right?
Yeah.
Water is a big big need in the unconventionals. And so, for instance, in Permian, we've gotten to where 50% of our water is recycled produced water in our completions. And so we're really marching towards that, as well as we've joined OGMP, which is basically a consortium of standardizing reporting for methane emissions. And so ConocoPhillips has taken that journey to zero very seriously. And I think going back to the other one, which is meeting that transition, we're talking about sustainable or renewables and whatnot. The transition's coming. I don't think nobody can predict exactly how fast it's going to come or what it looks like. But I think, if you look at outside consultants, you look at government agencies across the globe, right? I mean, I think the prediction for oil is we'll still have more oil demand in, 2040 to maybe 75%. There's a range there. So that's going to continue. There's only going to be an increasing demand in natural gas. I think as countries continue to switch from coal and other forms of generating power to natural gas, we'll see that demand increase. And then as well as LNG, right? Yeah. LNG is a big topic and a hot topic right now in the industry. So, we're participating in that. We're cleaning up our emissions as part of that and going to participate in that. I think as well as, we're also, you asked the questions about renewable, right? Yeah. So we formed a low carbon team within our corporate structure, our central structure. And so we've announced that we're focusing on carbon capture and storage.
Oh, nice.
Sequestration, I guess, as well as opportunities around the hydrogen markets as well, which will also utilize CCS.
Exactly.
So those are two of the areas we publicly have announced that we're working on, and so we're actively looking at those opportunities and seeing where they fit within our portfolio. And we've had some announcements on certain projects that we're doing.
Perfect. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask, if the company is trying to start any business related to carbon storage or hydrogen or geothermal. But yeah. Thanks for sharing that. It's definitely something really interesting now, and the companies, especially oil and gas companies, are navigating into this new segment in order to try to reduce emissions and meet the sustainability target by 2050 or so.
Yep.
As a leader, how do you approach tail end development and mentorship within ConocoPhillips?
So I think there's two answers to that, right? So first there's managing and developing my team,
Sure.
my organization as well, right? And then I also sit on, within ConocoPhillips, we have what are called talent management teams, which tend to be function specific, and we manage the global population. So I sit on that. So I have responsibility for help manage global population, and I represent those populations within my business unit, and then I have my team as well.
Great.
Right. So I think first is really understanding your team's, what their individual desires are. Where do they see their careers going? What do they want to do? What interests them? What are their limitations that they have personally or even career-wise that they want to consider? So I think I first try to understand where people are and where people are wanting to go.
Sure.
I think, and then it's kind of bringing my experience or my years of experience to help guide them and talk through, what do you think you want to do? How do you think you want to get there? Having honest conversations about their skill sets, things they're really good at, things maybe that they should consider working on. Are there cross-functional things that maybe would support where they want to go or what they want to do? So I think, and then being honest, as much as you can be.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of how I approach talent management of my team, and as well as a talent management team member, is just trying to understand where people want to go. How do I help them get there? And then kind of bringing some realism to it. But it helps, having been through multiple BUs, multiple positions, as well as interacting with leadership at my level as well, you kind of are able to try to guide some people, right?
Sure.
And I think, that's one of the hardest things especially when you're first a leader, is you're managing your own career as well, but you're also trying to manage other people's careers and help them. And so, and I think, and I said this, managing my own career, I think that's number one, right?
Exactly.
Because we're all responsible for managing our own career. So you have to be open with what your desires are, right? Where do you see yourself going? Where do you want your career to go? And then understanding what that takes or what may come with that. And then just being open and having honest discussions. But you also have to be willing to accept feedback.
Sure.
Right? I think feedback's another very important aspect of talent management is we're good at some things and we're bad at some things. And so I think being willing to accept that feedback, as well as a leader, sometimes it's hard to give that feedback. But I see it as our responsibility to give that feedback appropriately to help people grow.
Exactly.
And to see, okay, well, I may have a tough time doing this, right? So I have to figure out how to improve on that if that's required for some future opportunity or some future role that I want. So
Definitely, I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Growing up through high school, even here at A&M, I was terrified to stand in front of people and present and to talk. And even early in my career, I had instances where I was presenting or doing something socially and having to speak, and it was not pretty because I was just so nervous, right?
Exactly.
But I realized that's a very important part of the jobs I want to have, and so I just had to work at it, right?
Exactly.
You just kind of have to overcome it, and you have to practice, and you have to fail, right? You can't be afraid to fail, because the only way you're going to get better is to keep doing something that you're not good at.
And getting out of the comfort zone.
And getting out of your comfort zone, right? And I think that's important for career development is getting out of your comfort zone.
Sure.
I think, if you're a reservoir engineer, consider doing something else for a while, right? Something, whether it's production or completions or exploration. Being an honorary geoscientist. That's a little bit harder, but even in planning, right? Business planning, strategy work, right? Really expanding yourself to doing something you're not comfortable with or you haven't been taught or learned, right?
Sure.
And that only makes you a better employee, right?
Exactly.
So
perfect. Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying the discussion. We are approximately near the end of the discussion today, but I do have a couple of questions at the end. So since most of our members are students in petroleum engineering program, and since you are also a petroleum engineering student, you were like a petroleum engineering student, Students always have doubts about the future of our industry. So what advice would you give to students and young professionals in the energy industry who aim to make a positive impact and drive meaningful change within their organizations?
I wouldn't want to be doing anything different.
Uh-huh.
So I love this industry.
Okay.
I think for students, in the 80s, there was questions, is the oil industry over, right? In the late 90s, had we reached peak oil and was the oil industry struggling? I think we talked a little bit earlier, right? I think the demand for energy, is going to continue to rise.
Yep.
There are still a lot of parts of this world that are developing, and just part of that development comes an increased demand for energy. That energy is going to come from renewables as well as oil and gas.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Sure.
So there's always going to be a need for oil and gas, I feel like, for a long time. Somebody has to provide that oil and gas.
Absolutely.
And so this industry is going to be around for, I would say, for their current students for a while. Will it look the same? It might look slightly different.
Sure.
Who knows what that may look like.
Yeah.
But I would say the skills you're building, the things the students are learning are still going to be applicable, right? Even as we transition, say, to carbon capture and sequestration, right? There are subsurface, surface principles that are all the same, right? So yes, I think for our current students, if you like what you're learning and you think this industry is exciting, then definitely pursue it. But be flexible, I would say. Be willing to adjust and to learn, and be able to change, right? There are things that have changed in my career, right?
Sure.
Like the onset of the unconventional revolution, right? Never would have thought that early in my career, right? The idea of drilling in shale and drilling horizontal, 3-mile horizontal wells and fracking all down that, right? Never would have thought of that, right? And that's the common skill set now.
Exactly.
It's a common development methodology that we do in the U.S. and other people are trying to replicate. And so, yeah.
Cool. Thanks. One last question here. So since we are talking about students and they need to be open and maximize their skills, whether in engineering or maybe in other aspects such as business, finance, any other aspect that will add more into their resume. So in your opinion, if we want to focus on the other part of the story, which is universities, so what are universities lacking in their education systems right now that can promote more interest in the newest energy profile that we are witnessing these days? Any recommendation for universities, like for anything related to programs, a kind of certification, a kind of skills that they need to have their students be equipped with?
I think universities, especially engineering departments, have really adapted to bringing the finance part into it, right? You see a lot of people getting an engineering and masters in finance at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think that we've kind of solved that problem, right? Because that's a lot of what we do. I think for our industry, I think probably two things, and maybe we are doing this, maybe we're not, right? I think really understanding uncertainty in statistics, right? Because we're dealing with so much data, as well as so much uncertainty, that I think, we need to be putting students out who are comfortable working in that realm. Also, it's up data, right? Data analytics or AI or whatever, all the new things, right? We have a lot of data that we're dealing with. And I think understanding how to manage that data, how to utilize that data is very, very important. I think we're in the early stages of being able to leverage all that data to be able to help us understand what's going on and make decisions. But I think, that's really important coming out of school nowadays for young engineers, is to be comfortable with managing large amounts of data and how to analyze that data in a very different way.
Exactly.
But we cannot forget the basics, I would say, right? I think, sometimes we can move away from the basics or the basic principles and theories that we're learning in school. Right? Everything comes back to that in some form or fashion. Is if the data tells me something, does that make sense with what I've learned and the basic physical principles of what's happening, whether I'm drilling or completing or producing a well or modeling a reservoir, right? And so I think basics, engineering, physics, that's the core.
Sure.
And we have to continue to make sure we understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And then understanding all this information that we're collecting through internet or through transmitters and devices and whatnot, and what is it telling us, and then how do I marry those two to be able to make the appropriate decisions for my investments that we're making when we're drilling wells.
Yeah, perfect. So being committed to the cores, like technical aspect of any engineering degree, and trying to grasp some more skills in data, uncertainty, statistics, finance, this will add more
Yeah,
into
I think
the
that
profile of a
exactly, 'cause
candidate. Yeah.
there are very few, whether it's big companies, small companies, where you're only doing one thing,
Mhm. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
You know, everything we do costs money.
Yeah.
We're trying to get a return on that investment.
Sure.
Things take planning,
Uh-huh.
right? So I
Yeah.
think finance is important, whether you're a reservoir engineer, production engineer, drilling engineer, right? So I think understanding those principles and what's driving the company that you work for, and what are you trying to achieve? What is that company trying to achieve, and how do you fit your responsibilities into that? And then, yeah, we're going to see where the data goes, right? I mean,
For sure.
there's a lot of data that we have now, right? And so
Yeah.
is how do we leverage that
Exactly.
to our advantage,
Yeah.
right? To be able to get better returns on our investments.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much. This discussion was so amazing. Yeah. With this, we come to an end to our podcast today. Any final thought before we're ending this podcast today?
No, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come and talk. Like I said, it's always fun to come back and get on campus and to support Texas A&M, support the Petroleum Department. So I really appreciate the invite, and thanks for a great discussion.
Thank you so much. It's our pleasure to have you with us. Like leaders are like you are our idols, and we always look forward to have you and other people from ConocoPhillips in our department, because this is really something interesting and also encouraging for the students to see how like students or alumni from Texas A&M were going into large companies and they are succeeding in all of their work. So yeah, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll have you in a future event as well.
Always available.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.